Thank you.
Well, whenever you're ready. So again, kind of the format, as I mentioned, is about 30 minutes or so presentation, and we'll ask you a few questions. All right. Whenever you're ready.
Ready?
I think I'm ready. So I will share my screen with you when I
Sure.
have the presentation. Let me see here. I last used Zoom a while back, so I may have forgotten a couple of things about it.
Here we go.
You see my screen, please?
Yep.
Yeah, I can see it.
I'm already on the slides. Okay, so I would like to start by thanking you both for the help you've offered me in this dissertation journey, particularly Dr. Han. Uh, I remember you facilitated 2 courses for me on research methodology, and I remember the time I was telling you how difficult it was those days, and you gave me the encouragement to just keep pushing and I'll get it. I did get it with time, so thank you very much. And Dr. Richard as well. I don't have much words to say, like to express my thanks to you, but I have this photo just to show you how I feel about you. You're my superheroes. So
You're welcome.
this presentation is going to take the following outline. I will briefly talk about the background, literature, design methods, and I will spend most of the time talking about the results and the discussion because there were some really exciting and interesting results seen out of the study. If you read the dissertation, you saw those interesting results. So, I would like to start by briefly reintroducing myself in order for you to understand why I choose this research area. I was born in this small village called Awin in the town of Bamenda in the southern Cameroon. So we call it southern Cameroon. It used to be Cameroon. You can see Bamenda on the left side of the map there. And this place is full of very beautiful scenery. On the right, the photo on the right is a lake in that my small village. It's called Lake Awin. It's a very interesting lake. The reason I choose to maybe make mention of this is because uh, just after I signed up for my doctoral journey, a conflict broke out in this part of Cameroon, and that conflict has been the intensity has increased over the years, and it affected me both psychologically, materially, and in all ways. And one of the reasons I delayed in my dissertation was because of this conflict. Because I really find it difficult to put up with it. And if I were going to include a dedication page in my dissertation, it will be dedicated to my suffering brothers and sisters back home. So I grew up in Bermuda. I earned my bachelor's degree in physics in 2001, and I went straight into teaching mathematics and physics. And then in 2004, I relocated to China, where I began working at an international school as a mathematics and physics teacher, where I've been working until today. Although I've changed schools a number of times. So that is the background that leads to why I choose this research topic, because I need to improve myself professionally and educationally. The purpose of my study was to investigate which leadership behaviors, so leadership styles, laissez-faire, transactional, and transformational leadership dominate the leadership environment of international education in China. And in doing this, I compared the perceptions of leaders and their subordinates on leadership styles and leadership effectiveness. As you would find, uh, maybe not in academic literature, but maybe in some writings online, if you do some research on education, you'll find that mostly China is pioneering the whole world in the growth of international education nowadays. And there are two segments of international education here. There is one that is for expatriates, and another segment that is for Chinese nationals who are trained to go study some key universities overseas, say America, Canada, and European countries, and Australia, for instance. So, moving on to a brief review of the literature, although leadership has been widely studied, uh, there are some conflicting ideas about what leadership is. For instance, Fiedler considered leadership to be an uneven distribution of power and influence between leaders and their subordinates. Nordhaus considered leadership to be exclusively a power relationship. But although there's been these conflicting ideas, leadership, all researchers agree that the quality of leadership impacts employees' performance, and this is always reflected in their satisfaction, productivity, commitment, and their retention. So I will look a little bit at the development of leadership theory over the years. So leadership literature began with the great mind theory of leadership, which posited that leaders are born, not made, and this evolved into the trade theories around the 1920s to 1960s, where leadership was studied and leaders were studied on who they are, not on who they are, which came from the great mind theory. But then around the 60s, after the 60s, leadership changed, leadership studies changed focus to behavioral theories, where leaders were studied for what they do, not who they are. And that is how the full range leadership model came into place. It evolved from the behavioral theories. And in the full range leadership model, there are actually three leadership traits: laissez-faire leadership, transactional, and transformational. We all know that transformational leadership today is a leadership style that is mostly investigative. So on this figure, I have, excuse me, sirs, I am in the classroom, so the school bell is going on now. Excuse me. Okay. should be off now. So in this figure, I have summarized the full range leadership model in which we have laissez-faire leadership, where the leader is avoids leadership or takes his hands off leadership. And then there's the transactional leadership style, which contains the management by exception of behavior, where the leader leads by correcting, and the contingent reward, where the leader rewards subordinates contingent to what they do. Now, in the leadership literature, some researchers will place laissez-faire leadership as a behavior under transactional leadership, but some other researchers do not consider laissez-faire as a separate leadership style. So I decided to do the former in my study. And transformational leadership, which contains the 4 I's of leadership: individualized consideration, intellectual stimulation, inspirational motivation, and idealized influence. Now, the literature shows that laissez-faire leadership is the most inactive and the most ineffective leadership style, while transformational leadership, which contains the 4 I's, is the most active and most effective leadership style, with transactional leadership lying in between. However, leadership has to be investigated on a culture by culture basis. One leadership model may be applicable in, or may be effective in one culture, but it will be totally ineffective in another culture. And that is why I decided to investigate this in the culture of China, where, and then in this education industry where there is no literature on the full range leadership model, and where there is a mix of different cultures within the education industry. So I tried to find out how leadership can work in this kind of industry. So I'll move now to the design of the research. I asked 4 major research questions. The first one was, what leadership styles are predominantly adopted by international education managers in China? The second research question asked, how do superiors and subordinates differ in their perceptions of effective leadership in these organizations? The third research question asks, what is the relationship between perceived leadership style and subordinate performance at these organizations? And the last research question asks, how can the leadership practices of international education managers be enhanced to better benefit organizations they manage? So in order to answer these 4 research questions, I needed to posit 4 major hypotheses as well. I'm not going to go through and read through all these hypotheses, but what we should note is that the first 2 hypotheses here examine differences between leaders and subordinates. The first hypothesis talks about the difference between leaders and subordinates' perceptions of leadership style. And the second one talked about the difference between leaders and subordinates' perceptions of the impact of leadership on the outcome variables. And the last 2 hypotheses try to find out which leadership style had the most significant impact on the outcome variables, which included extra effort, effectiveness, satisfaction, performance, perception of performance, and perception of general leadership effectiveness or organizational goal alignment. So the theoretical framework of my research was designed in those four different levels, which are the four different hypotheses that I just mentioned. The first one compares the leader and subordinate perceptions of leadership style and finds out if there is some agreement or disagreement between the two. The second level of the research compared the perceptions of leaders' impact on leadership, impact of leadership style on the performance variables, and compared to see if subordinates and leaders differed in their perceptions of that impact. And the third level looked at the impact of leadership. We are trying to find out which of the leadership behaviors had the most impact on each of the outcome variables: extra effort, effectiveness, satisfaction, and perceived performance. While the last level looked at which of the leadership styles had the most perceived impact on organizational goal alignment with the general perceptions of leadership. So the methodology used in this study, I used a mixed methodology. First, because I wanted to actually experience better how to use both quantitative and qualitative methods. And secondly, because I wanted to improve on the construct validity of the study. So for the quantitative part, I used the multi-factor leadership questionnaire, but I did modify it in terms of the phrasing of the questions, and also I added some questions since there are more outcomes. I included 2 more outcomes, so I had to add some other questions in order to measure those outcomes. So this diagram explains the methodology in detail and indicates the different statistical methods and the methods I use to analyze data, the qualitative data. For quantitative data, I use regression analysis and t-tests, while for qualitative data, I used a thematic analysis procedure on in vivo. So, interestingly, almost all international education organizations in China have this structure you find here. At the top, there is an international education management company which opens schools in different parts of China, like in different cities. And in each of their schools, there are 2 principals, which are the leaders that I studied in this research. One of the principals in China, they call them co-principals. So one of the leaders is usually a local, while the other one is an expat or a foreigner in Chinese terms. And they usually have the same influence. Like there is no division of who has to lead who within the organization, but they have like equal power on each of the subordinates. So sometimes it may be a little bit confusing, especially for a new person in the industry. So I sampled 30 of these organizations, and out of I sent emails and I made phone calls, and some people I contacted face to face. And I had 9 school administrators reply to me specifically for the email, and 3 of the organization leaders responded in the affirmative. And of those three organizations, 4 leaders were studied because some Chinese leaders did not want to be studied. So, but of all the 3 organizations, the foreign principals accepted to be studied. And it included 7 subordinates. So I sent out the interview. Interview guides to them, and then we arranged a time for the interview. And after the interviews, then they were requested to take the surveys. The survey actually came in 3 different forms. There was an online survey, there was a PDF, a fillable PDF version, and there was a printed version. And they were requested to choose which version to use, and all of them, for some reason, choose to take the online survey. So I will now move over to the results of the study. The demographic results show that mostly the leadership was dominated by male. Only 1 female leader was involved in the study. And all of the leaders had at least a master's degree. 3 of them were PhDs, and 1 was a master. And all of the subordinates at least had a bachelor's degree, and there was 1 PhD and 1 masterate within them. Although the MLQ is highly reliable, I had to still conduct reliability analysis because I'm sorry, sir. I'm going to share the.
It's all right.
There we go.
You're back.
Yeah, the internet here is not that very friendly. So I had a Chromebox alpha of more than 0.8 for each of the instruments, indicating a very high reliability of the instruments. And then for descriptive statistics, I used Spearman's Grant correlation coefficient because I couldn't use Pearson's product moment correlation because the data were not continuous and I didn't test for its normality as well. And the correlation matrix shows very interesting results here. Interestingly, you would find that inspirational motivation has a very high correlation with all of the outcome variables, and it's only inspirational motivation that has this high correlation on all of the outcome variables with p-values of less than 0.05. And then to find the dominant leadership style, I found that while the leaders rated themselves mostly in the transformational domain, the subordinates did not find any dominant leadership style among their leaders. While this table or this figure shows the comparison, the table on page 71 of the dissertation document gives a more quantitative view of this with p-values indicated. Now, to test for the first hypothesis, I had to find out which the difference between leaders and subordinates, and if there was a significant difference in their rating of the leadership behaviors. And interestingly, subordinates rated higher for laissez-faire leadership, for their leaders, and the rating, the difference between subordinates and leaders was highly significant. Additionally, contingent reward was also significant, with leaders rating highest for contingent reward. And lastly, inspirational motivation was highly significant, with leaders rating higher. Then I also conducted T-tests. I also conducted T-tests on the leadership style, and only laissez-faire leadership was significantly different between leaders and subordinates. And then on the differences between leaders and subordinates for the perception of the impact of leadership on the outcome variables, just as the literature presumes, there was no significant difference between leaders and subordinates for any of the outcome variables. It's telling us that leaders and subordinates find that leadership has an impact on each of the outcome variables. And on hypothesis 3 and 4, finding the leadership style that has the most impact on each of the outcome variables, actually I conducted multiple regression on these leadership style and outcome variables in 2 steps. The first one, I used a stepwise method in SPSS, and the second one, I used the enter method in order to find out which of the leadership behaviors was the main predictor. And as we find on this table, interestingly, all of the leadership behaviors were found to be significant. They significantly impacted the outcome variables. And there were different behaviors that predicted majorly different outcome variables, which was very interesting here. So moving over to the qualitative aspect of the research, after coding the data, I found that there were instances, there were situations like for leadership behaviors that had differences between leaders and subordinates, but there were some others that did not have much difference. So now I will move over to the discussions part. I hope it's not taking too long, especially with the technical failure.
You're fine.
So a summary of my major findings, I'll just go through the summary very quickly. There was very little agreement between the quantitative and qualitative results for the leaders, but there was high agreement for the results of subordinates, which agrees with the literature on self-other agreements, where it is found that more reliable ratings of leadership can only be gotten from others, not from the leader themselves. And at the first level of research, subordinates differ significantly in their perceptions of leadership style. And then at the second level, the difference between the perceptions of leaders and followers of the impact of leadership on the outcome variables was statistically insignificant, as we have seen in the results. And at the third level, leadership has a significant impact on all outcome variables, as we have seen in the results section as well. And at the fourth level, I found that transformational leadership has a greater influence on the perception of organizational goal alignment or the general perceptions of leadership in agreement with the literature on transformational leadership. Interestingly, also, I found that leadership style influences general perceptions of leadership, and that this influence decreases from transformational through transactional and laissez-faire, meaning that if general perceptions in the organization have to be influenced, then the leader should better adopt a transformational leadership behaviors. Intellectual stimulation was the main predictor of general perceptions, which also tells us that in these kinds of organizations, if the leaders use intellectual stimulations, they can easily change the perceptions of their followers in the organization in all aspects. And this agreed with the high compact alpha that was gotten for all of these instruments. We have talked about the appreciative inquiry before, and this agrees that if everyone in the organization should have a positive feeling, then it will spread in all aspects of the organization. So for the research questions, as we can see here, for the sample organizations, the leadership style was predominantly, let's say, fair leadership, meaning that the organizations did not benefit from the benefits of transformational leadership. For the second research question, there were differences between perceptions of subordinates and the leaders. And this was even qualitatively acknowledged by one of the leaders in this quote that I included here. But quantitatively, the difference was not significant at the 5% significance level. Answering research question number 3, we find that there is no one-size-fits-all leadership behavior for organizational effectiveness within the sampled organizations. Since we have seen that in this figure, different main predictors significantly affect different outcome variables. And for the last research question, we look at table 15 again. We can use multiple behaviors. We can change our behavior, leadership behavior. At different times, we can use different leadership behaviors in order to impact different aspects of the organization, which brings us to the idea of a congruous leader. We cannot just study leadership or consider leadership to be something separate from the followers, but we have to include followers when we are talking about leadership. And so, who is a congruous leader? A congruous leader is someone whose leadership agrees with the expectations of followers. And this leader should be actively involved in action research to identify areas of weaknesses and areas of strength within the organization. If they find these differences, then they can change their behaviors as indicated in this table, but they have to first conduct research to find out which leadership behaviors are main predictors of which outcomes in order for them to know which behaviors to adopt to influence which outcome variables within the organization. For instance, if they want to increase extra effort in the organization, they could adopt II behavior. This is for the case of the sample organizations that were involved in the study. And if they want to improve in satisfaction within the organization, they could adopt IM behaviors. So based on the qualitative study, these are some of the characteristics of the congruous leader in these organizations that I studied. And so, what are the theoretical implications for this research? I brought about 3 theoretical implications. First of all, there is no research in this topic with international education organizations within China. So it's going to be the beginning of research in this area. And this research is going to contribute to mixed methodology as well as contribute more also in educational leadership research. However, there were some limitations. The biggest limitation was the sample size, which was very small, meaning that the study lacks external validity. And secondly, for the qualitative aspect of the research, I analyzed the data by myself, but I could involve other researchers in the analysis of data in order to minimize bias. And also, I did not consider the impact of demographic characteristics such as gender, age, and education when I was analyzing the data. That concludes my presentation. Thank you. And questions are welcome.
Very good. I enjoyed that, Vincent. Dr. Wardrope, do you have some questions for Vincent?
Well, I just had one that I just thought of as he was going through this. You did this on a Chinese company. If you were to replicate this study with a company based in the United States or the United Kingdom, maybe, or Germany, what would be the main difference you would expect to find in the results between a Chinese company and, perhaps a more Western?
Yeah, thank you. That was a very interesting question. I think I did think about that question as well. I don't know. I was expecting something like that. And I think that most of the participants, especially the subordinates, but also the leaders in this research, came from Western countries. As you would find, most of the workers, like teachers within the education industry, international education industry in China, are from the West. So it is possible that if it is done in a Western country, there will be no difference in the findings. But also in the West, there is different cultures. Within, like in the United States, there may be also the organization may be staffed by maybe Latin Americans, Africans together with Latinos, and those are different cultures. So it may also have there may be different results from the study. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah. I mean, it's a speculation. I think you probably find lots of difference, but it's, as you've indicated earlier, it's with globalization and everything, I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to isolate the cultures of corporations that are multinational and have connections with a lot of different cultures. I think everything is sort of merging together a little bit. But I was just wondering what you think might be a major difference, and I think there would be quite a few. So I agree.
Good. Any other questions, Dr. Wardrope?
No, I'm good. Okay. I think it was an excellent study.
Good. Yeah, I have a couple of questions, Vincent. One is kind of similar along those lines. Why do you think this study had never been done before in China or something similar?
Excuse me, I didn't get the question. Why I think there was never a study of this nature in China?
Yeah, why not?
That's a difficult question to answer, but I would just guess that maybe many people are not interested in studying leadership within these organizations. As if you have worked in any of these organizations, you will find that there's lots of different perceptions, people have different opinions about what leadership should be because they are coming from so many different areas. And it should have been something that people should be interested in. I know that Dr. Johannes, who also graduated in the same program a couple of years back, he conducted a study on the leadership in this industry, but he did not actually conduct the study on either transformational leadership or the full range leadership model. So I was talking about specifically the full range leadership model. No one has conducted a study on that yet.
Okay, good. The other question I always ask is, did you get any results that surprised you? You're expecting something you didn't get, or get something you didn't? Was anything that was unanticipated that came up?
Yeah. You remember when in one of the slides, I presented the quantitative data found no significant difference between leaders and subordinates in their perception of of how leadership impacts each of the outcome variables. However, by being within the organization as one of the members of these organizations, I thought there would be lots of differences here. So that was something surprising.
Good. Those are all the questions that I had. So kind of the next step in the process is if you want to log off for a couple of minutes, and then Dr. Wardrop and I will talk and come back on, and we'll go from there. And we thank your friends and your colleagues for attending, and invite them to log off so Dr. Wardrop and I can speak. And then Vincent, if you can log back in a couple of minutes, we'll go on from there.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Andrew Money, could you please log off? And Techo, could you please log off? I have my father watching me as well as
Glad you could join us.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay then.
Okay.